think I'll just start without further ado, since I imagine some of us are on lunchtime and trying to make the most out of this precious hour. Bonjour tout le monde, hello everyone. Welcome to the 7th Sleep Salon of the Sociability of Sleep project. I'm really delighted you're here today, and if it's your first time joining us, you can watch previous salons via our website / YouTube channel. My name is Kaminska, and I'm one of the co-directors of the project. I'm also an associate professor in media studies in the Department of Communication at the Université de Montréal. And I have the great pleasure of co-directing this project with Alana Thane, who is an associate professor of film and performance in the Department of English at McGill. The Sociability of Sleep is an interdisciplinary research creation project interested in the epistemologies, equities, and collective experiences of sleep and sleep conditions. We thank the Government of Canada's New Frontiers and Research Fund for supporting the research. The Sleep Salons would not be possible without the behind-the-scenes work of our postdoctoral fellow, Randy Vergara, and our project coordinator, Charlene Auré. Thank you to you both. And we have 2 more salons this year, the Stuff of Sleep, which is on April 20th, and the rescheduled Sound of Sleep on May 6th. So I'd like to offer an acknowledgement to the place from which we are reaching out to you today and the virtual technologies through which we meet. The Sociability of Sleep project is physically located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet, live, and rest. Tiohtià:ke has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Abenaki, and the Anishinaabe peoples. That we are meeting in a virtual space makes us no less occupants of multiple territories. Zoom is a technical custodian of the platform on which we gather, and its value has soared thanks to our virtual modes of assembly. Zoom's headquarters are located on Muwekma Alawan territory. The Alawan have historically understood about sustainability, communal societies, sharing space, and giving gifts to those who pass by. We might look to their horizontal organization to inspire different emergent models of peer-to-peer networking and assembly. The format for today's event will include 25-minute presentations by each of our guests, followed by a roughly 30-minute Q&A period at the end. You're welcome to post comments or questions in the chat along the way, either English or French, and we'll be happy to translate if need be. So at long last, the purpose for our gathering, our guests and speakers. So let me first introduce Diletta de Cristofaro. We'll start with her, her presentation. She's currently an Skłodowska-Curie Research Fellow at Politecnico di Milano University in Italy, and a visiting research fellow at Northumbria University. She's a scholar of contemporary culture, crises, and the politics of time. Diletta has published extensively on the contemporary apocalyptic imagination and is the author of the contemporary post-apocalyptic novel, Critical Temporalities and the End of Times, which is published from Bloomsbury 2020. She is now working on a literary and cultural analysis of the contemporary sleep crisis, a research project that has received funding from the Wellcome Trust and the European Commission. So we're really delighted to welcome Diletta, and over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks again to the Sociability of Sleep team for this invitation. It's really great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So let me just share my slides. Yep, hopefully you can all see it okay. Okay, so today, obviously, I'll be talking about my current research project, Writing the Sleep Crisis. And this is a project that basically explores the writing of sleep appropriately, given today's Salon's topic. So it explores the writing of sleep in contemporary culture across fiction, nonfiction, and digital culture. And specifically, I'm interested in tracing cultural engagements with the so-called sleep crisis. So contemporary societies presumed widespread sleep deprivation and rise in sleep disorders, a presumed crisis that I'm going to discuss more in a moment. And if you're curious to find out more about the project, beyond what I'm going to say in this talk, there's the website address on the slide and also the social media handles. Okay, so I'd like to start my reflections around the idea of writing sleep from the words of a writer, Ursula K. Le Guin. So Le Guin notes that, and I'm quoting, in fiction, sleep seldom plays a role, except by not being there when a character wants it. He tosses, she turns, they thump the hot pillow, and so goes the insomniac routine we're all familiar with. When a character actually goes to sleep, the novelist tiptoes quietly out of the bedroom, unless, of course, the character has a dream, the only drama sleep provides. So sleep eludes fiction, leaving only the footprints of dreams. So Le Guin's argument for why this erasure of sleep occurs in fiction is that sleep eludes description, which is the very stuff of fiction, together with what she defines as drama, so plot developments, twists, actions, which she says we find not in sleep, but in dreams. So sleep, as Le Guin puts it, is hard to talk about because it's what you don't know you're doing while you're doing it. So keeping this premise in mind about how hard it is to write about sleep as sleep, I want to pause for a moment on the passage on the slide from a 2018 short story by Julia Armfield called The Great Awake, which opens, I think, beautifully like this. When I was 27, my sleep stepped out of me like a passenger from a train carriage, looked around my room for several seconds, then sat down in the chair beside my bed. This was before they became so familiar, the shadow forms of sleep in halls and kitchens, before the mass displacement left so many people wakeful at uncertain hours of the night. The newspapers labeled it the Great Awake. So this short story is part of a flourishing contemporary genre of sleep apocalypses. So fictions that depict mass catastrophic pandemics of sleep disorders, mostly insomnia, as is the case of The Great Awake. And you have a few more examples on this genre on the slide, such as Karen Russell's Sleep Donation or Charlie Houston's Sleepless. Now, when confronted with such a passage, and more broadly with this flourishing genre of sleep apocalypses, it might be tempting to dismiss these novels and short stories simply as a reflection of Le Guin's point that sleep seldom plays a role in fiction, except by not being there when a character wants it. And indeed, by turning sleep into this kind of quasi-physical entity, a kind of shadow form that visibly accompanies each sleepless person, Armfield is somewhat circumventing the problem of writing sleep as Le Guin identifies it, which is that sleep is hard to talk about because it's what you do, it's what you don't know you're doing. And in The Great Awake, sleep becomes easier to describe, of course, but still mysterious. The sleeps, as they're called, don't talk, and their actions seem to be following a logic of their own. As the protagonist brother puts it, it's like living with a shitty poltergeist. But the sheer number of these fictions, there are way more than those examples that are on the slide, all published in the last 10 years or so, suggests, I think, something different than the mere representational impasse of writing sleep as something that always eludes us. By writing sleep as a problem, an apocalyptic problem, in fact, rather than taking sleep at face value as a state of repose that wouldn't seem to warrant much fictional exploration at all, these fictions are reflecting back to us a discourse that is ubiquitous today, the discourse of the sleep crisis, while also arguably gesturing to what might be at stake in this discourse beyond sleep itself. So I'm going to flesh out this argument further by looking in more detail at how sleep is written about in literary texts today. But before I do that, I'll just spend a couple of minutes discussing this idea of the sleep crisis. So sleep crisis, sleep debt, societal insomnia, these are all terms that are used quite interchangeably to denote the same phenomenon, which is the notion that contemporary society is profoundly sleep deprived, that sleep disorders are on the rise, and that this in turn brings about a series of other health issues. such as increased risks of Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, depression, and so on. And this is why, of course, within this type of argument, poor sleep quality and quantity are understood as a public health crisis, a public health emergency. So on the slide, you can find a quotation from the short introduction to sleep that clearly identifies this issue. So Lockley and Foster write that our treatment of sleep today is brutish, with most data collected from industrial nations over the past 50 years showing a general decline in sleep in line with the culture of long work hours, more shift work, long commutes, global communication across multiple time zones, and freedom from many economic and social constraints. These factors and the 24-hour availability of almost everything have conspired to demote sleep in our priorities, which has come at a price to our health and well-being. And to give you some more specific figures, this is an article that, a quotation from an article that came out in the special issue of Science devoted to sleep that was published just a few months ago. So this article maintains that community studies have documented that adults in the US sleep just 6.1 hours per night when objectively measured, well below the 7 to 9 hours recommended by experts. And evidence is emerging, the article maintains, that sleep duration and quality are even lower in developing countries and among the poor in rich countries. So this kind of data is endlessly regurgitated to us by the media. So on the slide, you can see a particularly dramatic headline about the sleep crisis from the British tabloid The Sun. Nightmare, the headline reads, getting less than 7 hours sleep a night could kill you, as experts warn Brits are in the grip of a sleep crisis. Now, hardly surprisingly, sleep science is a bit more nuanced than this headline would suggest. And indeed, I started my talk by saying that the sleep crisis is a presumed crisis, because not all sleep scholars actually agree that contemporary society is in the grip of this public health emergency. So neuroscientist Jim Horn, for instance, argues that sleep debt is overstated, as the great majority of us have sufficient sleep. But even those who, like Horn, contest the sleep crisis thesis highlight how widespread this discourse is. So for instance, sociologist Simon J. Williams points out that there is a readiness and willingness within professional and popular, if not lay culture, to frame or translate all manner of problems and issues into sleep-related matters, a process which itself engenders a sleep crisis of sorts. And indeed, as a literary and cultural studies scholar, it is not my job to establish whether or not contemporary society is in the grip of this public health emergency of poor sleep, but I can definitely tell you that the sense of a pervasive sleep crisis has come to dominate cultural production. So my work considers what this extensive writing of sleep as in crisis tells us about our society. And I do this by looking specifically at texts that are about sleep, so from the sleep apocalypses that I mentioned, to another flourishing genre, which is the insomnia memoir, or the various self-help manuals that seek to instruct us in the now seemingly lost art of sleeping well. But I also trace the ubiquity of this discourse, of the sleep crisis discourse, in texts that are not primarily about sleep at all. And I will give you an example of one of these texts in a moment. But first, I want to briefly return to the sleep apocalypse genre. So this is one of my favorite examples of this genre, Sleep Donation by Karen Russell. And if you haven't read this, I really, really recommend it. It was published in a digital-only format in 2014, but then in 2020, it was republished in paperback. And Sleep Donation imagines a near future world, very near, in fact. There isn't much difference between our present and what Russell's plot conjures up, except of course for this epidemic of total sleep loss called terminal insomnia, which leaves thousands of people incapable of sleeping until they die from this constant state of vigilance. And Russell's near future epidemic of terminal insomnia is obviously making literal current anxieties around a sleep crisis, as indeed I would argue is the case for this genre more broadly. So the epidemic and the situation surrounding it are more than once described as a sleep crisis in the novel. And what's more, when news about terminal insomnia begins to appear, people initially dismiss the disease as an exaggeration of a universal condition, because nobody has enough sleep in this society that closely resembles our own. So Russell writes, many people dismiss the disorder as an exaggeration of a universal American condition. Who was sleeping enough? Nobody. The crisis seemed like more TV hyperbole designed to keep us glued to our screens, watching mattress commercials. And while the causes of this sleep crisis, this fictional sleep crisis, are unclear, and indeed this is again a trope of the genre, it's never exactly clear what has caused the sleep apocalypse, speculation are always along the same lines as those about the sleep crisis of our own society. So you can find two quotations on the slide, one from Sleep Donation and one from The Great Awake, which sound remarkably similar to scientific literature on the sleep crisis. So in Sleep Donation, pundits speculate that sleep has been chased off the globe by our 24-hour news cycle, the bold eyeballs of our glowing devices. While in The Great Awake, pundits blame the crisis on phones and social media, 24-hour culture, and anxiety disorders. And these hypotheses echo scientific arguments about our presumed sleep crisis being caused by the nature of 24/7 society. So again, on the slide, you have a quotation from Lockley and Foster, who argue that 24-hour news coverage, all-night supermarkets, continuous internet availability chip away at our time for sleep. And these novels also echo arguments about the impact of our use of technology on sleep. In particular, electronic devices and their blue light, which of course has a detrimental effect on our circadian rhythms. So on the slide again, a quotation from Charles Czeisler, who links rising sleep deficiency to technology, he argues, decoupling us from the natural 24-hour day. But fictions of the sleep crisis do more, I think, than just reflecting back to us the scientific or popular understanding of this crisis. Rather, I think that these fictions use the image of non-sleeping bodies to communicate a number of concerns about 21st century life, illuminating really what is at stake in the widespread belief that we are in a sleep crisis, that we're not sleeping as much as we should. A belief that, as I said, isn't fully supported by scientific research, but that nevertheless is very much at the core of our society. And scholarship from the humanities and social sciences, scholarship about sleep, of course, has repeatedly shown over the past few decades just how much our sleep patterns, but also discourses around sleep, are intertwined with the world in which the sleeper sleeps or fails to. So on the slide, a quotation from Matthew Wolfe-Mayer, who I know was part of the Sleep Salons. And this quotation talks specifically about this imbrication of the biological and the social, the cultural and the natural, the historical and the emergent in the phenomenon that is sleep. So writing sleep, and specifically writing the sleep crisis, inevitably entails a reflection about contemporary existence, and the socio-political and economic systems we inhabit and sleep in, or try to sleep in. And one of the themes that recur time and again in these writings, and that I'm very interested in tracing in my research, is the relationship between our sleep patterns and understandings of ourselves as subjects within the neoliberal capitalist system we inhabit today. So to flesh out this argument further, I'll turn to a novel, Some Buyers Come, Join Our Disease, which is quite recent. It was published in 2021. And this novel is not primarily about sleep at all. It's not a sleep apocalypse novel. The protagonist does not even have a sleep disorder. Precisely for this reason, though, I find it particularly significant that we should find in this novel traces of the sleep crisis, as this really shows how pervasive this discourse is. And specifically, we find in this novel traces of the sleep crisis that indicate how the sense of a crisis is tied up with contemporary understandings of subjectivity. And I should say that this part of my talk draws on a forthcoming book chapter that should be out, I think, in 2023, in an edited collection about phones in literature called Telepoetics. So if you're interested in reading more of my analysis of Buyers alongside Buyers' novel, alongside other fictions of the sleep crisis that feature phones, there should be a longer version of this out soon. So the protagonist of Come Join Our Disease is Maya, who at the beginning of the novel is homeless. Maya is then given a second chance by a company that is seeking to make their charitable effort more successful PR-wise by giving the public, and I'm quoting, a narrative of measurable change with which they could engage. So in exchange for being the face of this narrative through an Instagram account named Maya's Journey, Maya is given a job, a home, and a smartphone, of course, with which she documents her journey. And note how the idea of this narrative of measurable change is tied up with objectives and achievements. So Maya's entire life, both professional and personal, in fact, arguably there's no more distinction between the two in Maya's case, turns into a project. And this is a project aimed at inspiring others to follow what I would call, drawing on philosopher Byung-Chul Han, or exemplary achievement subjectivity. So in Han's words, achievement subjects are entrepreneurs of themselves, a formulation that, of course, recalls typical Foucauldian theories of neoliberal subjectivity. But Han adds an important element to these theories, that of the affective dimension of this subjectivity. So in other words, what it feels like to be an achievement subject. So Han argues that today's achievement society is a society of self-exploitation, where the subject, driven by these kind of internalized imperatives of endless achievement and productivity, exploits itself until it burns out and is tired, exhausted by the rat race it runs against itself. And I'm obviously quoting from his book, The Burnout Society, and you've got a full quotation, couple of full quotations on the slide. So the burnout, fatigue, and exhaustion that characterize what achievement subjectivity feels like allows us, I argue, in my work on the writings of the sleep crisis, to understand these kind of widespread perceptions of the contemporary as a site of a sleep crisis, as it is indeed the case with Buyers' novel. So Maya ended up homeless precisely because of burnout, which resulted in her losing her job and income. In her new job, so the one she gets when she signs up for this kind of social media powered experiment that is Maya's Journey, is one driven by the paradigm of endless self-improvement. The job even entails a mandatory wellness regimen, which, as Maya notes, and it's the first quotation on the slide, means that even her body now belongs to someone else, so that it can enact more comfortably the tasks and routines of the PICT regime. PICT is her employer. So her sleep too becomes instrumental to the company. This is the second quotation on the slide. At night, Maya recounts, we would do our meditation and then sleep, only as to be able to function the next morning. Maya ends up once again utterly exhausted because of work, which extends well outside office time with the wellness regimen. But, Maya explains, sleep was something that came out of her time and intruded on her ability to do the things she wanted to do. So she comes to resent it. And she comes to curtail it even further than her work already does to regain some kind of degree of control over her life and time. So with her friend Zelma, a chronically ill activist, Maya starts roaming London at night, hijacking adverts that entrench society's imperatives, including those imperatives of achievement that are at the core of this subjectivity that Han talks about. So what they do, they kind of annotate and draw on these adverts. And then she posts these hijacked ads on her Instagram, subverting what was supposed to be this kind of faithful documentation of her journey of achievement, of herself as a kind of project constantly devoted to self-improvement. And significantly, one of the first ads they annotate is an ad that echoes the infamous Fiverr ad. You might have seen this ad, maybe heard of it. Fiverr is, of course, a gig work platform that went viral in 2017 for celebrating sleep deprivation as a doer's drug of choice. You can see the ad on the slide. And in Bayer's novel, the fictional ad that recalls the Fiverr ad goes, you get up at dawn, you do sprints in the dark until your chest feels like it will explode. You're the first one into the office, the last one out. You get by on 5 hours of sleep, then you get up and do it again. So this is clearly, as Byers brilliantly puts it, a narrative of aspirational second-person misery. So it's a narrative that celebrates sleep deprivation as the pathway to achieving one's goals. And Maya and Zelda annotate this ad by drawing bags under the eyes of the ad's woman and listing on her forehead the side effects of sleep deprivation. So they write loss of memory, loss of focus, poor decision-making, a feeling that everything is hopeless and unmanageable. Byers' novel thus perfectly captures sleep as the battleground of contradictory impulses and imperatives in the contemporary moment. So on the one hand, there is this sense that sleeping well equals a moral imperative to stay healthy and be a productive achievement subject. Think the mandatory wellness regimen Maya is subjected to. But on the other, this sense of achievement subjectivity can also lead to sleep deficiency, because we are bombarded with messages that tell us that curtailing sleep equals being a doer, as the Fiverr ad puts it. And these contradictory impulses and imperatives, together with this kind of affective texture of neoliberal achievement subjectivity, one of burnout, exhaustion, and anxiety, which contemporary writings of sleep capture so effectively, tell us why really the discourse of the sleep crisis is so widespread, even in the absence of data that supports the sleep crisis thesis without any further doubts. So I don't know how I'm doing with time. Probably I still have a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to conclude my talk because when I was invited to give this talk, I was asked to briefly talk about a recent initiative that we did as part of the Writing the Sleep Crisis project, and which is an initiative that has writing sleep at its center. So I will leave you with this. So it's an initiative that is called Sleep Stories, and it's a podcast series developed in collaboration with Durham Book Festival, a literary festival in the north of England. We commissioned 3 British writers, Selina Godden, Jan Ashworth, and Andrew Macmillan, to write 3 exclusive short stories about sleep that were then recorded as podcasts. And I mean, you can find the podcasts anywhere you get your podcasts, but for ease, there's also a link on the slide to the projects page where you can find the podcasts. And when commissioning these stories, we decided to keep the brief for writers really quite open and broad. So as I discussed in my talk today, my current research really stems from the idea that the sleep crisis has captured the popular imagination, that it has become one of the main ways we think about sleep. And so we write about sleep in our present, even though it is quite a contested idea in sleep research. So I was really curious to test this idea by seeing how the writers would approach the theme of sleep in the absence of any kind of constraints or directions from the festival and I. So we invited the writers to first come up with their idea of a story about sleep. And then once the story was already being developed, I offered to have a chat with them to suggest some sleep research that might further inspire the particular direction they had chosen. And two of the three sleep stories are indeed quite directly related to the sleep crisis, to this kind of imagery of lack of sleep, even though, as I said, I had nothing to do with giving them any kind of directions until the story was well in development. So without giving too much away, because I really do recommend you listen to the stories, they're absolutely wonderful. But The Night Watch by Jen Ashworth is about the damaging impact that work, in particular shift work, can have on our sleep. And Encroach by Andrew Macmillan explores the experience of a sleep disorder, insomnia. And we're open to develop a second season of the podcast. So yeah, hopefully there will be more to listen to. But I'll stop here. Thanks so much for the attention. And I'm looking forward to Julie's talk and to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Diletta. I have so much to read now, thanks to you. I'm very excited to welcome Julie Fleguer to join us in this conversation, since I think she might be talking about a different kind of sleep crisis. I hope I said your name correctly. So I will just introduce you briefly. Here are my notes. So Julie is a leading ambassador for narcolepsy and sleep and a strong advocate for patient-centered research and the importance of social support. She is the award-winning author of Wide Awake and Dreaming, a memoir of narcolepsy. As president and CEO of Project Sleep, Julie leads the organization's patient-driven advocacy, awareness, and education programs. For over a decade, she has fostered a variety of collaborations, including bringing together 29 organizations to co-lead World Narcolepsy Day and launching the Sleep Advocacy Forum to elevate the sleep community's profile within the national policy space. Julie has lectured at numerous professional meetings and keynoted at conferences across the US and the world, including most recently at the World Sleep Congress in Rome and TEDx in San Diego, co-authored papers in peer-reviewed publications, and authored a chapter in a narcolepsy clinical textbook. She has a JD from Boston College Law School, focusing on health law and rare disease drug development. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much. I'm just so delighted to be here. I love this series and was so honored to be included. So I will try to pull up my slides here. Let's see. Okay, hopefully that works. So a little bit about me. I had a very average childhood. I grew up a tennis player. I was tennis champ, New Hampshire state champion here. And I definitely, always had the mindset of working really hard and trying to sneak in as much as possible to get the most out of my life. And so definitely in high school, burned the candle at both ends to try to get into the college of my dreams, and was a squash player in college and just very, very busy always, and didn't really have any issues too much. I was an art history major in college, and I also did some creative nonfiction writing, was my other passion in love in college. However, my dad did encourage me to consider law school after college, and he got me interested in that by talking about art law. So that's actually why I went to law school. But to back up just a year, when I graduated from college, I moved into my first grown-up apartment in the Fenway district of Boston. And one of the first nights I lived in that apartment, I awoke to hear a burglar breaking in, and I saw a man rush at me with his arm stretched out towards my neck. And I tried to get up to move away from him, but the weird thing is I couldn't move to respond. And so I just kind of shuddered in terror, thinking like, what's he about to do to me? And then I looked up again and he wasn't there, and came to realize that there hadn't been a burglar. But this was very strange because I'd had many dreams before. I knew what dreams felt like. This didn't feel like a dream. This felt like it had happened. Around that same time, one day I was just joking around with my roommate in our living room. I was about to go for a run along the Charles River. And as I laughed, I felt this strange kind of like melting in my knees or buckling, almost as if someone had poked behind my knees, but no one had. It was the strangest feeling. And I just said to my roommate, "Did you see my knees just did something weird?" She said, "No, I didn't see anything." I forgot about it because it was a very momentary feeling until I felt it again when I was laughing. And after a few times like this, I would say to my friends, "Don't make me laugh, my knees, my knees," that they were, kind of giving out for a split second. So as I said, my dad convinced me to go to law school, and I was very happy to go to Boston College and stay in Boston. I wasn't concerned. I'd always had a strong work ethic. I knew I would succeed in law school, but law school did prove more challenging than I imagined. My class notes often started perfectly at the beginning of class, like bullet points and color coded, but by the end of the class, they would be a jumbled mess. Celebrities' names mixed in with property law. It was really embarrassing. I would be reading in the library for many hours and, thinking I'm making good progress, only to realize I didn't remember any of what I'd read. And after a few months of law school, I really reached this kind of low of thinking maybe I'm not law school material, or I'd somehow lost my willpower, although wasn't sure where my willpower had gone because law school felt very important to me. At the end of my first year of law school, though, we were in exams, and so I was able to get a full night's sleep. And there was one morning I got up and I drove just 15 minutes to school in the morning, very simple 15-minute drive. But I woke in the parking lot of the law school in my car, parked fine, but I didn't remember getting to school. I didn't remember choosing the parking spot, pulling into the driveway of the law school. I had no memories of those moments. And that really, really scared me. And it was like I saw all the excuses that I had for so many years, that I wasn't a morning person. I wasn't a night person. I hadn't had caffeine. I had too much caffeine. There was no more excuses. I was like, who can't drive 15 minutes to school in the morning after getting a full night's sleep? And that was the first time I thought, maybe I have a sleep problem. So even though the first primary care doctor I did see that summer, she suggested that my sleepiness could be normal, that everyone gets tired when they drive sometimes, and that even she had to pull over, get a coffee. I didn't feel satisfied with that answer, and eventually underwent a 24-hour sleep study and was diagnosed with a serious case of narcolepsy with cataplexy just after my 24th birthday at the beginning of my second year of law school. So once I did find these terms, narcolepsy with cataplexy, it was pretty clear I had all the major symptoms. Excessive daytime sleepiness was why I was having trouble driving and studying. Cataplexy was this muscle weakness triggered by emotions, which, my knee buckling with laughter was only getting worse and worse. So I was glad to find an answer for that. Hypnagogic hallucinations and sleep paralysis. The burglar who had come to my apartment had come many times, along with other things like a cat scratching me, and then waking up and realizing I don't have a cat. At the same time, still being able to feel the cat's scratches on my arm, and then knowing I don't have a cat. So when I saw all these terms together, it was pretty clear this is what had been happening to me, even though I never associated these things with each other. I never thought that the sleepiness had anything to do with the knee buckling laughter. And I never thought of the burglar incidences as even a medical issue. I had told my brother about that, and he said that happened to him in college and it went away. So I was just waiting for those to go away. But I was glad to find the answer at age 24, of course. From there, I really thought that my story was over. I was going to take care of this, and then it's just no big deal. I'll take treatments and I'll go back to my life as planned. This is a little speed bump. It turns out it was a bigger speed bump than I realized. Adjusting to treatment was not as easy as I thought. And there were side effects, and it was a lot to get used to. And I still had to deal with the symptoms as well. But I just want to say that probably the hardest part was the sense of distance I felt between myself and my friends and family. that I was going through so much, but I didn't have the words to explain it. And I felt like there was all at once this glass wall up in between me and my friends. Like when I talked about my narcolepsy specifically, like one of my best friends just kind of looked at me like I was different. And I thought, I want to be like, I'm the same me, I'm the same Julie. But it felt like something had shifted and I just couldn't get people to understand. And that social side was really, 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 really challenging. And I think it's really underrated. So really one of the first people who got it was my dad. And so my dad and my stepmom dragged me to a narcolepsy network conference about 7 months into my diagnosis. And I kind of resisted going. I didn't know what it would be like to meet other people with narcolepsy, but I was so glad that they went. And for one weekend, like narcolepsy was normal. And, you know, it was great to talk to other people. But I want to read a quick passage from my memoir about my dad's experience at the conference. On Sunday morning, Dad came into my hotel room to talk over the logistics of the conference and the drive home. He turned to leave and then he stopped at the door and walked back toward me. Had he forgotten something? I'm so proud of you, Jules. He opened his arms to hug me, which was strange. He wasn't much of a hugger. He'd always been sort of an awkward dad, not the touchy-feely type. He hugged me tightly and then his body began to shake and I realized he was crying. Weeping, really. He convulsed in my arms. I'd never seen him cry, never mind felt him cry. It made me so sad I didn't want to hug anymore. I'm so sorry, he repeated between sobs. It's okay, Dad. He finally let me go and sat on the edge of the bed, rocking back and forth and clasping his hands tightly. It was a place he'd seen me many times. He'd listened patiently to my hopeless sobs. Now I sat next to him on the bed, unsure what to say or do. I didn't understand before, but I get it now, he finally said. It's much worse than I realized. Funny, I thought he'd understood my narcolepsy better than anyone else, but now he thought he got it. It's not your fault, I said, but it's not fair, you're so young. It's gonna be okay, Daddy. This was a white lie and we both knew it, but what else could I say? Eventually he calmed down and left. I looked around the bare hotel room and finished folding my clothes into my suitcase in silence. The conference had a big effect on Dad, perhaps bigger than it had on me. Now he held his own burden, to love someone deeply, his youngest child, his fabulous Jules, and watch her navigate a serious illness. He'd always been my knight in shining armor, helping me through all my lowest points, but he couldn't save me from narcolepsy. So it was really hard to see him upset, but at the same time, I really needed to have someone to share this journey with and help me carry this new part of my life. I went on to study health law, policy, rare disease drug policy, trying to understand why there weren't better treatments yet for narcolepsy, and really became passionate about that. At the same time, I think law school was interesting. It kind of made me realize that often policy changes came after social changes, that society decided something was important, and then policy often reacted to that. And so as I thought about moving forward, what I was going to do next with my life, I felt like if I wanted to see policy changes for conditions like narcolepsy or, sleep policy, we needed to open society's hearts and minds to these conditions first. So I did have that background in creative nonfiction and thought that, narcolepsy wasn't what I expected. I never, in the first few years of the experience, I wasn't taking notes thinking, oh, this is going to make a great book someday. Like, I just wanted this to not be part of my life. Like I was like trying to push it out of my life and ignore it. But at some point I did switch and realize like narcolepsy is fascinating. And I hadn't seen an honest story that resonated with me. The movies about narcolepsy were so inaccurate. It just didn't resonate with me at all. And so, knowing that I had the creative nonfiction background, I thought maybe this is something that I could do. to help share my own story. And speaking up was new. I actually stayed quite private about my experience of those 2 years of finishing law school, because my dad had been an employment lawyer. So he'd always said, don't put this online, don't raise your voice, you could be discriminated against. That just didn't sit well with me over the long term. I felt like there was this growing, voice inside me, like Ariel, from The Little Mermaid. Like I needed to speak this. I couldn't just keep pushing it down. And so, and realizing too that we were kind of caught in this catch-22, that for narcolepsy specifically, we didn't like misperceptions of narcolepsy, and that often kept people silent. And so if we were silent, how were those misperceptions going to ever change? And that we somehow had to break this cycle. So I moved to Washington, D.C. after I graduated from law school to start advocating and start working on my memoir, which I published in 2012. And I also just want to mention Dr. Oliver Sacks was one of the writers that really inspired me when I read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, I believe. I, for the first time, saw a way that I could speak about these strange experiences that had been happening to me in a more empowered way, because of how he wrote about, he's a doctor, but he was often writing about, patients with strange neurological conditions in such an empathetic way and getting their experience across in such, a neat way. So if you're not familiar with his work, definitely check out Dr. Oliver Sacks, but he was one of the major inspirations for me to sharing my own story. And let's see. I just want to share one other quick passage from my book as we think about sleep. And, for me, these borderlines between being awake and being in dream sleep, it's hard to figure out how to write about some of it. And so I just wanted to share a passage about a hypnagogic hallucination and sleep paralysis experience from, this is when I'm in my 3rd year of law school. And I was studying for constitutional law final exam. This is probably the day before the exam, I believe. I was studying I was part of the intellectual property club. So we had this office, and that's where I was. A few minutes later, I awoke to keys jingling outside the office. Maybe one of the other group leaders was coming to get a book or to use the mini fridge. Good timing, I thought, as I was just waking up. All I had to do was sit up and appear normal. I tried to sit up, but my left cheek lay cemented against my arms over the table. The door was on my right, so in order to see who was coming in, I needed to lift my head long enough to at least turn over onto my right cheek. I tried lifting again. I pulled with neck muscles pulsing. It was no use. A gargantuan force held me down. The doorknob rattled. Perhaps it was the cleaning staff coming in to take out our trash. I pushed with all my might. Being caught waking up would be unbearably embarrassing. During the struggle, a strong electrical vibration surged up my back. My neck muscles shook violently, totally outside of human experience. Maybe my hand or foot was caught in electrical current? The shock moved through me for a few seconds, maybe longer. I wasn't sure. I was only conscious for a snapshot of extreme discomfort before my mind washed back into darkness. The keys jingled again. With all my might, I lifted my head up off my hand pillow and squinted at the door. Thump. My head dropped again to the table. I tried to look at the door again. I needed to see who was coming. Then everything was silent. No keys, no doorknob, no resistance, no cement, no electric shock. New and different sensations flooded my body, racing, raging, gasping, surging, my body lit with adrenaline pumping through my veins. My head lifted and dipped like a buoy in chopped water as my muscles came and went. I breathed deeply after a prolonged inability to do so. My eyes darted to the door handle. Had someone been outside? My memory of the sound was fresh and real, but no one had come in. Maybe I'd heard keys jingling from outside a neighbor's office and got confused. My spine was numb from the odd electric pulsation. My thought process was slow, and eventually I realized this was probably just another imaginary intruder. I looked at my books and notes, the piles of inanimate words that needed to enter my brain for my exam the next day. My head was like a stormy wasteland between dreams and nightmares. How was it that this fake world seemed so much more real to me than reality? I was not sure how to proceed, how to move from the surreal to the real. It was a war between my own body and mind playing tricks on me. I wanted to move on and reconcentrate on constitutional law, but a crucial piece of me was gone. I was both the predator and victim of the intrusion. I should have been able to move back into reality seamlessly. My exam was the next day and I was far from prepared. My insatiable hunger to succeed that had pushed me through long, arduous study sessions in high school and college felt like a past lifetime. I had all the same pressures now, but I might have as well been dead. I decided to call it a night. I'd get up early the next day to try to cram as much as possible before the exam. So just an example of trying to make sense in writing from some pretty strange experiences I had. Eventually in 2013, I founded Project Sleep, which I won't get into most of our programming here today, but I want to talk about, some of our awareness raising and some of why, we use storytelling so much. If you think about narcolepsy in 1999, I think a lot of people in our field would think of this Cell cover that, we had this great discovery about the genetics of narcolepsy. 1999 was also the year that Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo came out. And I'd still to this day say that movie that I've never actually even had to watch the full movie, but it's impacted my day-to-day life more than the great hypocretin orexin discovery from that same year. I hope that changes eventually if there are hypocretin agonists that come out, but I think we don't think about this other story of the social story of narcolepsy and some of these major things like these movies that make such a huge impact. An example, you'd think, is it better? Have we done better? This is a Vanity Fair article from 2018 by this writer who said, narcoleptic Trump official Wilbur Ross now in charge of monetizing space. So this was an old man. I'm not sure if he's qualified for his job or not. And he had fallen asleep in a few meetings. He wasn't necessarily a person diagnosed with narcolepsy, but you can see here that she used the term narcoleptic as saying that he wasn't qualified for that job. So I did write to Bess, and she did write back and say, and explained that she shouldn't have used that term and went again in the future. But she's a pretty smart writer before that. So you think, do you really have to do that? But yeah, I won't go into this, but I think it's important to know that that stigma is very real in narcolepsy, and there are many layers to this. And the otherness that people feel after a diagnosis is a big part of the experience. It's hard to communicate about because narcolepsy is not very simple. If it was just so simple as falling asleep while you're standing, that would, I don't know, maybe be more easy to deal with. But it's actually a much more complex situation involving a lot of different factors. I love this cartoon from Alice in Wonderland. It's hard to explain. I can't explain myself. I'm afraid, sir, because I'm not myself. When something new and different is happening to you, it can be really hard to communicate about. And sleepiness can be really invisible. The same way that Diletta was talking about how sleep is not really something that is something we're aware of or conscious of. Sleepiness is so invisible. So here's just a picture of me from Vegas, and people say, oh, you look so great. And actually how I felt that night, because it was so late waiting for the Skrillex to come play this set, my eyes felt like they were on fire, but that was an internal experience. So if we think about how do we raise awareness and reduce stigma, I think there's really a myth that if we share statistics, that's raising awareness. And if we share our stories, that's because you like hearing yourself talk. People have said to me, oh, you just want a fan club, you're just so obsessed with yourself, and that's why you want to talk about yourself. So I just wanted to share, this great example from one of my favorite books, Made to Stick, from this example of a donation letter. They did a version of a donation letter that talked about the stats and the magnitude of the problem. They did a second version that was information about one young girl. And so these are donation letters. So then they are able to see that from the first donation letter, they got, $1.14. The second version, they got $2.38. So obviously this was very effective to just tell the story of one girl. So they did a third version, which they thought, let's put information from both letters. Maybe that's the sweet spot, stats plus storytelling. And actually that one still got less than just telling a story. So storytelling, I think, is really, really powerful. And I love this too. I found this more recently, information deficit model, coined in the 1980s to describe a widely held belief that the public skepticism about science was rooted in a lack of knowledge. This feeling that only the public knew more, they would be more likely to embrace scientific information. And this is just not true. So we really need to be careful in how we think about raising awareness and making sure we're not just trying to throw stats and facts at people to make them make behavior changes. And so again, I really believe in storytelling, and there's research driven to show how important and impactful it can be. So as part of Project Sleep's programming, we train storytellers to share their story. And we have a great group. We have over 100 graduates who are trained storytellers, people with narcolepsy, idiopathic hypersomnia, and most recently sleep apnea. And this summer will be our 6th training of storytellers, and we are hoping to continue to expand to different sleep disorders and train people on sharing their story. And hopefully you can help us find story sharing opportunities. What's fascinating about what we're doing is it's not actually part of medical school curriculums to include patients, speakers. It's not a part of our conferences often to include patient speakers. It's not, I don't know how patient voices ever left the conversation, but it's something that we are working really hard to change, because patient insights are really important, I believe, and should be equals at the table alongside researchers and clinicians in conversations, which is also why I'm so delighted to be invited to be part of this series. And so, we have these trained speakers and they are presenting at many different places, but if anyone on here would like a speaker in person or online, we have great speakers, and I'm happy to connect you. I just want to share one storytelling tip today that we train our speakers on, and there's a lot more that goes into it, but one tip is creating one-time scenes. I think often as people with sleep disorders, when we think of telling our stories and the way that we are trained to tell our stories when we speak to doctors often is to lump a bunch of different things into more generalities, that every day of high school, I was falling asleep in, class, or, and I think it's logical to think also that when something happens to you every day, that's so much more important than something happening just one day, right? And with a chronic illness, it is often every day or so often. And so I think when we speak in these generalities, though, we don't allow people to enter our stories into specific places, specific times. And so as we train storytellers, we really make them break down their stories into one day. One day I was so tired that I had to sneak into the theater to fall asleep in one of the seats. Or, as I described my story, one night waking up to hear a burglar. And that can be challenging because also some of this can be really fuzzy to remember exact experiences, but I think it's really, really important that we break down our stories from generalities into one day or one night or one time examples. So that's just one of the tips that we share through the Rising Voices program. Thank you again for including me today, and just want to share this. One of my favorite quotes is that the stories that we share today shape the world we live in tomorrow. Thank you again for letting me share a little bit of my story with you today.
Thanks so much, Julie. And I have so many questions, and I'm sure people who are listening probably do as well. And I kind of want to start maybe just as people are gathering their thoughts, since I was thinking about this already kind of all along, is this interesting connections between, or like the overlaps between the different your interests, you, Diletta, and you, in terms of like, obviously we put you together to talk about writing, but you're talking about such different experiences, and the forms of writing are so different. Like one, you're thinking about insomnia as this very like having a very large place in society, about fiction, and Julie talking about a rare condition and sort of the storytelling aspects of it, like the memoir, the personal stories around that. And I'm just curious if, like, if maybe Diletta, you can, if you have any thoughts about or reflections on the place of the rare sleep disorder in narrative fiction or in popular culture as you are studying it. So we have such a tendency to associate sleep production around insomnia. Have you, where has your research led you in terms of these other sort of conditions and sort of the sleepiness that happens, and not just lack of sleep?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, in the sense that you're absolutely right. I mean, insomnia is definitely the kind of disorders that gets the most spotlight in fiction. Interestingly, one of the examples that I didn't mention in my presentation of the kind of sleep apocalypse genre goes in the entirely different direction, and it's basically it's called The Dreamers by Karen Thompson Walker, I think, hopefully, and it's basically the exact opposite. So people fall asleep and don't wake up for something like 2 months or something like that, and then all of a sudden they wake up again. So that's, off the top of my head, the only kind of example that I can think of in fiction that actually explores, I mean, in contemporary fiction, of course, that actually explores something that is different from insomnia, basically. And of course, again, it's like with the kind of epidemics of total sleep loss that I was talking about in the presentation. This too, of course, is an exaggerated kind of disorder. But yeah, there is often, because there's another novel, again, it's kind of apocalyptic novel by Douglas Copeland. This is from 98, I think, which is Girlfriend in a Coma, that again uses this image of an epidemic of basically people just falling asleep and not waking up, and what that could mean for society. And there is this, interesting kind of reflections about the coma as a possible image of contemporary society. And, there's a lot to be said, for instance, in terms of how, because of course, sleep is related to attention, right, in some ways. And so on the one hand, there is this kind of trope where the person that suffers with insomnia is suffering from insomnia because they're paying too much attention, as opposed to these kind of other novels in which the kind of image of these people falling into these kind of comas effectively, again, are a symbol for a society that isn't paying enough attention. But again, these are, of course, examples that aren't faithful representations of these disorders. They're absolutely paradoxical, because, of course, they're trying to create these paradoxes to talk about society in ways that are not necessarily realistic, but are supposed to tease out certain tendencies within society, I would say.
Thanks for that. I don't know if, Julie, you want to just bounce back on that in terms of like your own maybe frustrations at always seeing insomnia as being the sort of prevalent condition discussed, or is that just something that is on the periphery for you?
I actually don't feel that we have, at least from my perspective, we don't have a lot of firsthand stories from people with insomnia as storytellers. And insomnia definitely gets attention, but it's also very important, and it's very under treated, or it's a lot of people maybe are on medications, but not getting CBTI. So from my perspective, we need a lot more stories from people with insomnia, sleep apnea. I mean, sleep disorders, chronic sleep disorders impact 1 in every 5 people in America. So that's a lot of people. And we just don't, and they're very underdiagnosed because people are going years, decades driving, living, thinking that their sleepiness is normal, or even insomnia, thinking that this is just because of their anxiety. And if only they, fix their anxiety, their insomnia should go away. And so we need a lot more storytellers and people that are maybe writing some creative stories that are people that are more familiar with the real conditions, So there are some great people in our community. We have a comedian who has narcolepsy, and she's created a short movie about her experience as a comedian with narcolepsy. And that's the kind of stuff we hope to see more of, because these sleep conditions are so fascinating, and there's so much rich, there's a lot that's really rich for fiction in the real experiences. What we found is that often the people that are making things about sleep don't actually have as much familiarity to make the stories as rich and cool as they could be based on the real experiences.
Yeah, probably just as narcolepsy is stereotyped in films, so is insomnia and other conditions that are more common. Alana, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you so much for those amazing talks. Really compassionate and really interesting. And I have questions for both of you, but maybe I'll start with you, Julie. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the scene of storytelling and maybe some of your fantasies about not just that stories get told, but where and how they get told. I work a lot on reproductive health, and I think often about a kind of shift in gynecological practices when they went from training medical students to do pelvic exams on anesthetized women who often didn't even know that that was happening, to having live pelvic exam models who could speak back, who are awake and would speak back to patients doing exams on them. And I think to me, that's a scene of storytelling that I find incredibly impactful. So where would you go in a kind of fantasy world with this kind of sense of storytelling?
Oh, goodness. Well, I believe that, that patient voices just need to be equals in these conversations, and other communities have already established that. So it's really challenging sometimes to go back to the sleep world, because I'm part of this broader patient, community through Stanford MedX and Society of Participatory Medicine that already sees this, the importance and the value. You see conferences like the Parkinson's World Congress, where they have a third of the people at the Congress are people living with Parkinson's or their care providers. So it's hard to then go back to the sleep world, where even as I was at World Sleep last week, a world-renowned researcher and clinician who I respect so much said to my face that he doesn't need to hear from patients at conferences like this because he talks to patients every day. What you say to a doctor when you have 15 minutes to 30 minutes to speak to a doctor does not represent the entire experience of living with a condition. And so I think that you really need to move away from that as much as possible, and realize that there are insights and that we could change research priorities. I think the social side of narcolepsy and sleep conditions needs to be studied, but otherwise the research stays very much driven only by the perspectives of these clinicians and researchers, and not to say that they have any bad intentions, but I just don't think it's as patient-centered as it could be. So, one of the things I've seen that I always wish we could adopt is that if some prominent people in our own sleep community said, I will not speak at a conference unless one patient is also a speaker. That has happened more in the broader space. Some leading people have done that, and that's helped to shift the culture. Or, if someone was going to sponsor a conference and said, I won't sponsor your conference unless there's at least one patient speaker. These are ways that you can get people to change their thinking. And I think over time, we'll see the value.
Alana, do you have a question for Diletta as well, I think?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Thanks so much for that answer. I often think of that phrase, nothing about us without us, and how critical that is around forms of knowledge sharing. And I think storytelling is so accessible in some ways, especially if you get some of the tricks I really appreciated your sharing a tip that I think will be very, very useful for many of us. Diletta, thanks also for an amazing talk. And I was stuck on the slide where you were talking about burnout culture. which seems so accurate. And you were talking about the dilemma of writing about sleep and that, we don't have access to this kind of experience. And I was thinking about I reject the language of like, oh, sleep is your individual problem, just work on yourself, et cetera, et cetera. It's so frustrating. But I wonder if you found in your research that there's something specific about sleep as this kind of absent experience, right? As this kind of gap in our lived perception of ourself that might make it in some ways easier for people to kind of create a kind of double that they can download all of this sort of problem and management onto, whether there's something unique about sleep that's made it particularly susceptible to becoming a kind of actionable site for working on the self in a way that might be different than something like other forms of health related conditions.
That's a super interesting question. I mean, obviously, what I'm finding a lot in these texts that I'm looking at is that basically the writing of sleep becomes a way to talk about a variety of different things, right, that don't necessarily have anything to do with sleep, or if they do, it's very minimal, but it's the idea that it becomes a vehicle for talking about other things. So specifically like lack of sleep, exhaustion, and the idea of being tired, and so forth. But also, at the moment, I'm working a lot on sleep trackers and how the kind of language of sleep trackers and apps and so forth. And I'm struck by this idea of the sleep goal. Because, what's your sleep goal? Like even an app like Calm that is supposed to be, about relaxation and so forth, actually on the home page, it literally says, what is your goal? And one of the things is improving sleep or improving my focus, a series of different things. So it's interesting to me that this language of goals and achievements has become so pervasive, even in the ways in which we think about actually solving our sleep issues. And part of the problem, I think, is that, of course, by being rooted in this kind of language, these apps in many ways don't really do much to help, because it just becomes another goal, effectively, right? Something else to achieve, something else that we need to very closely monitor and act upon. So again, like if, normally we think about sleep and rest as a kind of respite from society and from, what is going on around us. Of course, we know from, decades of sleep studies, especially in sociology and the humanities, that of course, our sleep is very much imbricated with the rest of the world. Well, then again, here we see very clearly in these kind of apps and gadgets and wearables how, we're basically our sleep is very tied up with kind of ideas of productivity, achievement, and so forth. And that's a massive issue, I think.
Do we have other questions from the floor? Since I think Alana and I could probably just chat with Julie and Diletta all day, but perhaps others would like to intervene and have some questions as well. You can just raise your hand or chime in.
Well, I have a comment back on what Diletta was saying. I think that's such a fascinating point of view, because what I see with the sleep trackers is that it's probably attracting a lot of people who might actually have a diagnosable sleep disorder. I had a friend who had pictures of her sleeping on every vacation, and for many, many years before we became friends. And at one point she said, well, I'm going to get a Fitbit and I'll start tracking my sleep, and that'll be the solution. And those devices, as of yet, I don't think ever lead. They pretty much say, like, this is not to diagnose a sleep disorder. They kind of shove it to the side, even though that could be 1 in 5 people that have it. And then it's about this other thing that, again, is under your personal control. And what you said about, again, about how that does sleep only matter because it makes us more productive during the day? Even as I was preparing my TEDx talk, I felt like, is that what I need to show? Do I need to just talk about sleep in the way that it just makes you better it's going to make you prettier, it's going to make you smarter, and be able to achieve your goals more during the day? And that's too bad that it can't just kind of stand on its own or be something else. But yeah, I definitely think that the tracking apps and the language that's used around them is giving false hope of a solution to people that probably have sleep disorders and causing a lot of anxiety and maybe even more sleep issues.
Jen, your turn, I think. You want to hit your hand?
Hi, as you can imagine, I was on another Zoom before. And I couldn't send a picture, so I put it as my background. Anyways, I have had insomnia my whole life. In fact, I was 20 minutes late for this because I fell asleep at about 6 o'clock in the morning and missed 2 alarms. What I was going to ask is that when you have gone through kind of different types of, to see different types of doctors or whatever, did you ever feel like you were more of a curiosity than a patient that they wanted to help? Or like, I think that you were saying about these apps, there's some language that is almost transactional, like, you can sleep if you do this, or you have to have a life that is specifically geared toward getting up in the morning and going to bed at night or whatever. And then if we kind of ignore all that, like, I think it was Eleanor that was saying her friend did that. And it's true that it's very liberating, but also when people kind of take you into their sleep studies because you're a curiosity to them, and then like nothing ever helps, and you're just like, why am I doing this? It's a strange thing. Like, I don't know. I mean, I lived in Switzerland, so I'm not sure if the same thing happens here for sleep issues, but I thought it would be really interesting to, instead of it always being a kind of a medical thing where people follow you in terms of a sleep study with, electrodes and video or whatever, that there is another person with insomnia included. Somehow like a third party that is there actually just watching you and that can really take notes, not just on video, but just to see what's happening. And as you were saying before, something about including what did you say? Nothing about us without us. I thought it was interesting because it would be really cool if during those sleep studies that there was another insomniac. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, we really would love in the future to have more patient support programs where people can get matched up with other people with the same condition and talk to them, because I think that's a huge part of the healing. And I didn't talk about that as much. I talked about the big scene of my dad understanding, but there's nothing like the understanding of another person that deals with the same thing. It's just a different level. It's a different kind of friendship. So, I think that also helped me take less pressure. It took pressure off of my law school friends to get it. Once I had my narcolepsy community and they got it, I realized I could kind of didn't necessarily need everyone to understand. So I think there's a huge importance of that social support being part of the journey for sure.
Yeah, it was interesting when you were talking, I asked a specific question. You just happened to answer it exactly after I asked it about if you ever masked in terms of society, like, did you ever just pretend that you didn't have it? Because it's just too, like you said, not everyone has to understand, right? And sometimes it can be just exhausting to constantly, I mean, a lot of people, if you say I have a sleep problem, people are like, so do I. Or I have narcolepsy, so do I, just slept on my desk. It's like, no, that's not it. But it kind of becomes a circular conversation, but which is okay. Not everyone's supposed to understand everything. But I was just curious if sometimes socially you would mask it, let's say at jobs, or you said that your dad had maybe suggested that you didn't tell. Like, how did you feel about that? What did you do?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up, raising my voice was more important to me because I saw that we were kind of stuck in this cycle. However, that doesn't mean that every single day I want to be the person that's raising awareness. I have found that it's often situations where I think, oh gosh, like I'm getting my nails done and they're asking me, you know, what do you do? And I said, I wrote a book. And they say, what about? And I go, oh gosh, do I really have to have this conversation? I just want to get my nails done.
Yeah.
And I'll go for it. I'll say, you know, it's about narcolepsy. And then we end up having this insightful discussion. The person probably understands me better than some of my own friends, you know, and it's really wonderful. So you just never know.
You don't.
And I try to just go with the fact that that every conversation's an educational opportunity. But that depends on how patient I feel probably each day. So, I think the best we can do to share to some degree, because otherwise then we're just thought of as tropes from movies. And unless you know the real people that are really living with this, that's when you start to have empathy and understanding that this could be something that could happen to you or a loved one. So yeah, I think it's important, but it's not for everyone. It's not for every day.
No, you're not the representative. You're a human. But yeah, I get it. It's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Juan, did you want to say the question?
Hi, yes, sorry for being late. Kind of going off. Sometimes I don't drink anymore, but at my age, like I'll go to bars, and I would just kind of like have a drink because people automatically think you're carrying water. So that's an explanation that I don't want to have. But when it's with narcolepsy, it almost feels like after explaining, it almost does more. It does more. It doesn't help. Like it does more harm than good. It just confuses people more. And then I'm like, because it's not such a easy thing to explain. So I'm an hour into a conversation that I'm so tired of having, and but there gets to a point where you want to begin a relationship with somebody, a friendship or something. So eventually it's going to come up, and it's just I started going to work groups, following Julie with Project Sleep and the Narcolepsy Network, and it seems that that's where I get the most, where people actually understand, because it's almost like, well, you should be well rested. You slept for like 3 days, and it's like, it's not like that. There's so many things that I'm I'll come back around. Sleep is such an interesting topic, and I know we're kind of just like figuring these things out, but I don't understand. I don't understand why more doctors don't go into that field, or more people aren't as interested to know, because you always have people that want to know, like, what do my dreams mean, and this and that, and we know that if we don't get enough sleep, that's bad for you. We get too much sleep, that's bad for you, and yet with people with narcolepsy, there's not like that much funding as a rare diseases. Like it really has. I mean, just yesterday the rat race was on. I mean, and I'm like, man, there's like there are a lot of things in the media um, uh, to explain it, and they had this movie Ode to Joy, and that's maybe as close as it gets. I've been trying. I graduated from Florida State. Uh, uh, it was an English degree, to try to write and kind of encompasses, but it's so subjective. It's kind of very stream of consciousness. I just don't know how to put it into
Come
words.
be part of the Rising Voices program. We want to help you share your story.
April 15th. No, April 15th.
Good.
I wanted to, but I started seeing how almost in a visual medium, it might be better transcended to people. And
well, we need all the different ways. So writing, visual mediums, we just songs, I see a guitar. We need all the different mediums. So there's no one right way. We just have to do all the paths, all the stories. So, and yours will be part of it. I know it.
I just like people don't read us. One thing that really irks me is a lot of people have opinions of, well, you have to, you should run, you should do this, and they're like, I'm like, where's your doctorate degree? So I've actually like printed out like very simple abstracts. Like, you have to realize that it's very complex. Like, it's kind of upsetting that some emotions trigger like these like we start falling asleep. And I think it's a really cool subject, and I've been kind of working on for the past 3 years, just kind of filming myself while I sleep. Like camera gear, so San Diego 3 years, and trying to figure out how to get people interested in. It's something that should kind of be like that people they like to talk about, and it's an interesting topic, but I just don't ever see it portrayed or hear about it, as much as insomnia, for example. And it's it used to be scary, but in my opinion, it's kind of cool is not the word for it, but
we'll get there. We'll get there. I'm telling you, give us 10 more years. And also remember, social change is slow. And so many things, people's opinions change slowly over time, but I know that we'll get there. I really believe it.
I think we're kind of running out of time. Sorry, but Susanna has had her hand up for a long time, so I just wanted to take her question if you don't mind, and then we'll wrap it up at that point. Susanna, so if you had a quick question for us. You're muted though. We can't hear you.
I'm Susanna.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So thank you for these wonderful presentations. I'm so pleased with the whole project. I'm a writer, and when I found out about your website, I was exhilarated and so delighted to see all these things. I'm writing a novel called Slumberville, which I started like 20 years ago, and then I abandoned it to write other books, and now I've come back to it. It's called Slumberville, and it's about a sleep research lab. So all these things, I was so excited to find out about all the, what you're doing. And many of, I would like to get in touch at some point when I can. This is my first contact with you. So it's been fascinating. I did publish a story, although this novel, I did publish a story which was selected for Best European Fiction, which is called Ostrichine. All the subjects you've raised here are very interesting. I was going to say to Diletta, is it Diletta? There's in 100 Years of Solitude, there's an epidemic of insomnia. There's a few pages about an epidemic of insomnia, and that's very interesting. The whole town is affected by it, and they have to write down the name of everything because they start becoming really forgetful.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm just very pleased to be listening to you. I really hope that for sleep disorders, of course, I think the more we try to change, everyone tries to change the way society is organized, because obviously it doesn't, you know, it doesn't include people who suffer from certain conditions, the way society is structured. And what else? I don't know, I'm very pleased to meet all of you, and I hope I was going to apply for a residency advertised by you, but you know, I'm unable to do it. Unfortunately, maybe another year. I'm just very pleased by everything that you are doing. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks for joining us. I think we'll leave it at that for today. So thank you, Julie and Diletta. I am so delighted that you were able to join us, and you can have information about our next salon that was posted in the chat, and this one will be posted on YouTube, our website, as soon as we get around to doing the subtitles well, and hopefully we'll see you soon again. So have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was amazing. Thank you.